Hold on a moment, ladies and gentlemen, and cast your minds back, way back to the year 1268. Time of knights in castles, of grand tournaments and whispered secrets. Beneath the shimmering silks and clanking armor was everything as romantic as the stories tell. Did the soaring ideals of courtly love truly embrace the hearts and minds of the women it claimed to adore, or did it leave them grappling with challenges no poem could ever solve? Number 1, it focused on male fantasy rather than female experience. Imagine, if you will, the grand hall of a mighty castle, perhaps somewhere in Aquitaine or Flanders, in the year of our Lord 1268. Troubadour, fresh from his travels, strums his lute and sings of a lady, so pure, so noble, so impossibly beautiful, that merely to gaze upon her causes a knight to fall into an agony of devotion. Pledges his undying fealty, not to his king, but to her, his distant, unattainable lady. He undertakes impossible quests, fights fearsome dragons, and endures immense suffering, all in her name. His love is a torment, a spiritual journey, a path to self-improvement through pain and longing. This, scholars tell us, was the very essence of courtly love, an ideal sung about in countless verses and cherished by those who penned them. But now let us shift our gaze from the adoring knight and the lofty ideals to the actual woman, the object of all this fervent adoration. Was she truly living a life of spiritual transcendence and effortless grace? Was her day filled with the joy of being the inspiration for a noble knight's suffering? The historical records and the insights from many chroniclers suggest a starkly different reality for most women, even those of high birth. For the male poet, the lady was a muse, a symbol, a means to an end for his own moral and artistic development. Perfection was often a projection of his own desires and internal struggles, not a reflection of her complex humanity. She was the sun around which his universe revolved, but only insofar as her light illuminated him. Consider Lady Isabel, a noble woman of the time, perhaps the very inspiration for a troubadour's latest ballad. While the knight is off slaying imaginary dragons for her, Lady Isabel is dealing with the very real, often messy, details of her daily existence. The courtly love ideal saw her as a static image, a beacon of virtue. Rarely, if ever, delved into her internal world beyond her presumed beauty and goodness. Did she have aspirations beyond being adored? Did she worry about the harvest, the health of her children, the political maneuvering of her husband? Did she feel trapped by her societal role, or perhaps simply bored by the endless duties of a medieval household? The poems are largely silent on these matters. The knight's suffering, his longing, his trials were the central drama. The lady's role was to exist, to inspire, and perhaps to occasionally grant a favor, a glove, a ribbon, a fleeting glance. The narrative of courtly love, as passed down through the chansons de geste and troubadour poetry, was fundamentally a male-centric story. It was about a man's journey, his challenges, and his self-discovery through the adoration of a woman. It was a mirror reflecting his own desires and virtues back to him, with the woman as the polished surface. The woman herself, as a fully formed individual with her own dreams, anxieties, and agency, was often reduced to a two-dimensional ideal. Problems, her daily struggles, her actual voice, were largely absent from this grand, romantic vision. It was a story told about women, but rarely by them, and even less often for them in any practical, empowering sense. The ideal celebrated a woman's unattainable perfection, but overlooked her very real, and often imperfect, humanity. Number 2, it perpetuated isolation and lack of female solidarity. In the intricate social tapestry of 1268, women, particularly those of the noble class, often found themselves navigating a world of limited connections and constrained choices. While the image of medieval castles might evoke bustling courts, the reality for many high-ranking women was one of relative isolation, especially those managing sprawling estates in the absence of their husbands, or those confined to their chambers during long periods of childbearing. Courtly love ideal, far from fostering a sense of community or shared experience among women, often exacerbated this isolation and inadvertently encouraged a subtle, or sometimes not so subtle, competition. Consider the narrative of the courtly lady. She was often depicted as the singular object of a knight's devotion, set apart from all other women in her beauty, her virtue, and her unique capacity to inspire such profound adoration. This emphasis on individual, unparalleled perfection created an unspoken pressure. Could one woman truly share her experiences, her joys, or her profound problems with another, when the very ideal of her existence was to be unique and unrivaled in the eyes of her suitor. If a knight's love was meant to elevate and distinguish his lady above all others, then what space was left for genuine, supportive female friendships? Imagine Lady Margox, known throughout the region for her charm and grace, finding herself the subject of a renowned knight's poetic odes. While she might enjoy the flattery, her position simultaneously made her an object of envy for other women in the court or neighboring castles. The courtly ideal did not celebrate sisterhood or mutual upliftment. Instead, it subtly pitted women against each other for the attention and devotion of powerful men, even if that devotion was purely platonic and artistic. If a lady was deemed the most beautiful or the most virtuous, it implicitly suggested others were less so. This dynamic, while not overtly hostile in every instance, certainly did little to encourage deep bonds of solidarity among women. Furthermore, the very secrecy inherent in many courtly love scenarios contributed to this isolation. The affair, even if spiritual, was often a clandestine one, a private understanding between the knight and his lady. Confiding in another woman about such a delicate matter, especially one that could be misconstrued or used against her in the unforgiving social climate of the time, would have been an immense risk. A misplaced word could lead to scandal, ruin, and the loss of reputation for the woman involved. Therefore, these intense, personal, and often unconsummated relationships, far from bringing women together, forced them further into themselves, compelling them to bear their joys, their anxieties, and their societal pressures in solitude. Grand narratives of heroic knights and idealized ladies rarely paused to consider the quiet moments of shared support or mutual understanding that might have offered real solace to women navigating the complex expectations of their world. Number 3, it ignored the lack of educational opportunities for women. In 1268, the pursuit of knowledge and formal education was largely the domain of men, especially those destined for the clergy, law, or specific administrative roles. While noblemen might learn Latin, rhetoric, and strategy, and some might even dabble in philosophy or science, the avenues for intellectual development for women were remarkably constrained. A woman's education, if she received any beyond basic literacy, often focused on household management, religious instruction, and perhaps some rudimentary arithmetic for estate accounts. Skills like embroidery, music, and dance were also valued, but these were primarily for social graces, not for intellectual enrichment or independent thought. Yet the courtly love ideal often presented the lady as a figure of profound wisdom, capable of discerning the knight's true worth and guiding him on a path of moral rectitude. This was a significant disconnect between idealized image and lived reality. Courtly lady, as celebrated in poetry, was not just beautiful. She was often depicted as possessing an innate discernment, a keen judgment, and a profound moral compass. The knight sought her wisdom as much as her favor, believing her spiritual purity made her a superior moral authority. But how was a woman, whose entire upbringing and societal role limited her access to formal education, philosophical texts, or public discourse, supposed to cultivate such deep wisdom? The very sources of knowledge that would empower a man to understand the world and make informed judgments were largely inaccessible to her. She was expected to embody wisdom without being granted the means to acquire it. Consider a young woman, perhaps Lady Avelina, growing up in a noble household. Her brothers might be sent to a monastery school or tutored by a chaplain, learning Latin, reading texts, and discussing theological concepts. Lady Avelina, meanwhile, is taught by her mother or a governess how to manage the servants, prepare remedies, supervise the spinning and weaving, and perhaps read a prayer book in the vernacular. She might learn to play a stringed instrument or sing. While these were valuable skills for her role, they were not designed to cultivate the kind of intellectual depth or critical thinking that would allow her to genuinely guide a knight on his moral quest or engage in profound philosophical discourse. The ideal of the wise, discerning lady was thus largely a projection, a convenience for the male poet to elevate his muse, rather than an accurate reflection of what medieval society allowed or expected of women. Moreover, the courtly love narrative rarely, if ever, showed the lady engaging in scholarly pursuits, debating with clerics, or reading ancient manuscripts. Her wisdom was often portrayed as intuitive, almost mystical, born from her innate goodness rather than from rigorous study or intellectual engagement. This perpetuated a stereotype that women did not need formal education to be wise, their wisdom simply was. This subtle dismissal of the need for intellectual development for women, masked within the glowing praise of their inherent sagacity, ultimately reinforced the very limitations on their educational opportunities that existed in 1268. Presented an image of female wisdom that did not require the messy, challenging, and often subversive act of actual learning and intellectual inquiry. Number 4, it did not address the class disparities among women. The glittering world of courtly love, as depicted in the popular narratives of 1268, was almost exclusively confined to the aristocracy. The ladies who inspired such poetic devotion were high-born, often married noblewomen, residing in castles, adorned in fine garments, and surrounded by servants. The knights who adored them were also of noble lineage, with the leisure and resources to pursue such idealized passions. This narrow focus completely overlooked the vast majority of women living in the medieval world, effectively rendering their experiences, their struggles, and their lives invisible within this dominant cultural narrative. Imagine the sharp contrast between the idealized lady of the courtly romance and a peasant woman, perhaps named Agnes, working in the fields outside the castle walls. Agnes in 1268 would have spent her days toiling from dawn till dusk, plowing, planting, harvesting, tending livestock, grinding grain, and performing countless other back-breaking tasks to ensure her family's survival. Her hands would be calloused, her face weathered by sun and wind, and her body often weary from continuous physical labor and repeated pregnancies. Agnes, the concept of a knight suffering for her distant affection, would have been utterly alien, perhaps even laughable, if she had ever heard of such a thing. Her daily concerns revolved around food, shelter, safety from bandits or disease, and the crushing burden of feudal obligations. The courtly love ideal, therefore, was a luxury. It was a cultural construct accessible only to a tiny elite who had the privilege of leisure, literacy, and a social structure that allowed for such elaborate emotional games. It offered no solace, no recognition, and certainly no practical benefit to the overwhelming majority of women in medieval society who were not noble. Problems faced by peasant women: poverty, hunger, disease, harsh labor, lack of legal rights, and vulnerability to exploitation, were entirely unaddressed and unrecognized by the courtly romance. The idealized lady in the poem did not worry about paying her tithes or fearing crop failure. She did not experience the indignity of serfdom or the daily grind of survival. Moreover, even within the noble class, there were hierarchies. A wealthy countess might be the subject of a knight's affections, but what about her poorer relatives, the orphan nieces, or the ladies in waiting who served her? Their lives, while better than a peasant's, were still far removed from the idealized image of effortless beauty and grace. They too had their own struggles, often related to securing advantageous marriages, managing meager dowries, or navigating complex social politics. Courtly love narrative simply glossed over these realities, presenting a homogeneous image of the lady that was divorced from the very real and diverse experiences of women across the social spectrum. By ignoring these profound class disparities, the courtly love ideal inadvertently reinforced the existing social order, celebrating the romantic lives of the privileged few while remaining utterly silent about the daily struggles of the many. Number 5, it offered no avenue for genuine intellectual partnership. While the courtly love ideal sometimes elevated the lady to a position of moral and spiritual guidance, it rarely, if ever, presented her as an intellectual equal or a partner in scholarly pursuits. 1268 intellectual life, particularly in its more advanced forms of theology, philosophy, law, or science, was almost exclusively the domain of men within the church, universities, or royal administrations. A man might seek his lady's wisdom or solace, but he would not typically seek her informed opinion on a complex legal dispute, a philosophical debate, or the management of a vast domain requiring advanced literacy and numeracy. The ideal lady's wisdom in courtly love was often portrayed as intuitive, spiritual, and moral, rather than intellectual or analytical. She was seen as a beacon of virtue, capable of discerning the knight's true character and inspiring him to greater deeds through her inherent goodness. This was a passive form of wisdom, one that did not require active engagement with texts, abstract reasoning, or critical analysis. The knight might write poetry for her, but he would not, as a rule, discuss his strategy for a difficult siege with her, or consult her on the latest theological arguments circulating from the University of Paris. Consider the daily reality of a nobleman and his wife in the 13th century. The lord would attend councils, discuss land disputes, review legal documents, and engage in political maneuvering that required a degree of literacy, understanding of law, and strategic thinking. His wife, while responsible for the household, might oversee servants, manage provisions, and perhaps rudimentary estate accounts. Her education, as we have noted, would not typically equip her for the kind of intellectual engagement her husband might pursue. Courtly love ideal did nothing to bridge this educational and intellectual divide. Backed by focusing on her inspirational and moral qualities, it implicitly affirmed that intellectual parity was not a necessary component of the ideal romantic relationship. If a lady did possess unusual intelligence or a love for learning, it was often considered a curiosity, perhaps even a slight eccentricity, rather than a quality to be actively cultivated and celebrated as part of her role in a romantic partnership. The emotional and spiritual aspects of courtly love were paramount, but the intellectual dimension was conspicuously absent. The knight's suffering, his poetic expression, and his chivalrous deeds were the core narrative. The lady's role was to be the recipient of this adoration and the source of his inspiration, not a fellow traveler on an intellectual journey. This limitation meant that for women who might have yearned for intellectual engagement, courtly love offered no outlet or validation, reinforcing the societal barriers that kept them from fully participating in the intellectual life of their time. Number 6, it did not consider the threat of scandal and social ruin. While courtly love was often depicted as a pure, spiritual, and unconsummated devotion, the line between idealized admiration and actual impropriety was incredibly thin and fraught with danger for the woman involved. In 1268, a woman's honor and reputation were paramount. They were the very cornerstones of her social standing, her family's prestige, and her future security. Even the appearance of an inappropriate relationship, regardless of its true nature, could lead to devastating consequences, yet the courtly love narratives often glossed over or romanticized this perilous aspect. Imagine a noblewoman, Lady Alara, who is the beloved muse of a famous troubadour. He sings her praises, writes passionate letters, and openly declares his devotion in a public court. While he might frame his love as spiritual and pure, the gossip mill in a medieval castle operated with ruthless efficiency. Whispers would circulate, insinuations would be made, and even the most innocent of interactions could be twisted into something scandalous. For Lady Alara, the stakes were incredibly high. If her husband or her family suspected an actual affair, or even just a relationship that brought dishonor, the repercussions could be severe. For the knight, the consequences of such a love being discovered might involve a temporary disgrace, a duel, or perhaps a period of exile. While not insignificant, these were often recoverable. For the woman, however, the risks were far greater and often permanent. She could be repudiated by her husband, stripped of her dowry, sent to a convent against her will, or confined to a secluded part of the castle. In extreme cases, her family might disown her, leaving her without any means of support or protection in a society where women had very few independent legal or economic rights. Children, if she had any, might even be considered illegitimate, jeopardizing their inheritance and standing. The very fabric of her existence could unravel, all for a love that was supposedly pure and spiritual. Courtly love poems, however, rarely explored these grim realities. The lady was often depicted as enjoying the adoration, perhaps even subtly encouraging it, without acknowledging the immense personal risk she was undertaking. Focus remained on the knight's noble suffering and his idealized devotion, rarely turning to the dark shadows of potential scandal and ruin that loomed constantly over the lady's head. The narrative of courtly love, therefore, presented a highly sanitized and unrealistic version of these relationships, ignoring the very real social vulnerabilities and punitive consequences that medieval women faced if their reputations were compromised, even by a pure and poetic admiration. It was a dangerous game played with a woman's life and honor as the highest stakes, often without her having full control over the outcome. Number 7, it provided no legal or economic agency. In 1268, a woman's legal and economic standing was largely determined by her relationship to men, her father, her husband, or sometimes her brother or son. she had very limited legal rights of her own. She could not typically own property independently once married, engage in contracts without male consent, or represent herself in court. Her dowry, which was often substantial, passed into her husband's control upon marriage, even if it was intended to support her in widowhood. This severe lack of legal and economic agency meant that women were highly dependent on men for their survival and social standing. Courtly love ideal, for all its spiritual elevation of women, did absolutely nothing to address or alleviate these fundamental limitations. Courtly lady, for all her ethereal beauty and virtue, was still subject to these harsh legal and economic realities. She might inspire a knight to embark on a crusade, but she could not inherit her father's full estate if she had a brother, nor could she, in many cases, even manage her own inherited lands without her husband's approval. If her husband was a poor administrator, abusive, or simply absent for long periods, courtly love offered her no practical recourse. Provided no legal standing to challenge his decisions, no financial independence to escape a bad situation, and no means to protect her own property or person. Consider Lady Beatrix, whose knightly suitor, Sir Gawain, composed sonnets to her matchless eyes. While Sir Gawain was busy writing verses, Lady Beatrix might be silently contending with the harsh reality that her husband, Lord Robert, had squandered their estate, or that he was threatening to disinherit her children from a previous marriage. Sir Gawain, through his purely spiritual devotion, offered to represent her in a legal dispute, help her secure a loan, or advise her on managing her increasingly depleted resources. No. The entire framework of courtly love was outside the realm of practical, legal, or economic assistance. Its very nature was based on yearning and spiritual admiration, not on tangible support or empowerment. Indeed, the idealized lady of courtly love was often portrayed as being above such earthly concerns, almost a disembodied spirit of beauty and virtue. This depiction implicitly reinforced the idea that women did not need economic independence or legal power. Their value lay in their moral purity and their capacity to inspire, not in their ability to manage a household's finances or assert their rights in a male-dominated legal system. By glorifying a woman's passive role as an object of adoration, courtly love effectively sidelined any discussion or aspiration for women to gain greater autonomy in the very real, often brutal, economic and legal landscape of medieval Europe. It offered emotional escape, but no practical solution to the daily struggles stemming from their inherent lack of agency. Number 8, it created unrealistic expectations for emotional support. Courtly love, with its emphasis on intense emotional yearning, spiritual purity, and often unrequited devotion, created a powerful fantasy of emotional connection. The knight would pour out his heart to his lady in verse, sharing his deepest sorrows and aspirations, believing her to be the only one who truly understood him. He sought her compassion, her inspiration, and her gentle guidance. While this might sound beautiful, it set up an intensely one-sided flow of emotional need and expectation, offering little in return for the woman. Imagine a knight, Sir Lancelot, burdened by the pressures of chivalry, warfare, and court politics. He turns to his idealized Lady Guinevere, pouring out his emotional torment in secret letters or private moments. He expects her to be an unwavering source of empathy, understanding, and inspiration, a pure and virtuous anchor in his turbulent world. But what about Lady Guinevere's own emotional landscape? Did she have anxieties about her children's health, fears about her husband's battles, or the constant pressure of managing a vast household? Did she experience loneliness, boredom, or the profound grief of losing a child to disease, a tragically common occurrence in 1268? Courtly love narrative rarely depicted the lady needing emotional support from her knight. She was typically portrayed as the giver of inspiration, solace, and understanding, not as someone who required it herself. Her role was to be the unblemished beacon, the constant star that guided the knight through his emotional storms. This placed an immense, often invisible, burden upon the woman. She was expected to embody unwavering emotional strength and purity, a perfect receptacle for the knight's confessions and needs, without her own vulnerabilities or struggles being acknowledged or addressed. If the lady did feel sadness or fear, the courtly ideal offered no mechanism for her to articulate these feelings to her adoring knight, let alone receive genuine emotional comfort in return. His love was for her idealized image, for her role as his muse, not necessarily for her full, complex emotional reality. His focus was on his own suffering and his quest for her favor. The emotional transaction was primarily outgoing from him and incoming to her, with little expectation of reciprocity. This dynamic meant that while courtly love promised profound emotional connection, for the woman it often delivered only an added layer of emotional labor and the silent burden of being the perfect, unshakable source of solace for another, without the luxury of receiving it herself. It created a beautiful but deeply unequal emotional economy. Number 9, it reduced women to objects of desire or inspiration. One of the most persistent threads running through the courtly love ideal in 1268 was the reduction of women to either objects of a knight's unquenchable desire or disembodied sources of inspiration. While the poetry might laud a lady's virtues, her intelligence, or her moral rectitude, these qualities were often presented as secondary to her physical beauty or her capacity to inspire the male protagonist. The woman's agency, her individual identity, and her complex inner life were frequently overshadowed by her role as a catalyst for the knight's actions and emotions. Consider the pervasive descriptions of the courtly lady. Eyes were like stars, her hair like spun gold, her skin like lilies and roses. Her beauty was often catalogued in exquisite detail, making her a visual spectacle, a feast for the knight's admiring gaze. While beauty has always been celebrated, in courtly love it became almost the primary qualifier for a woman to be deemed worthy of such high devotion. Her worth was often intrinsically tied to her physical perfection, placing immense pressure on women to embody an unattainable physical ideal. If she was not beautiful, or if her beauty faded with age or illness, did she cease to be worthy of such love? The narratives offer little comfort on this front. Beyond her physical allure, the lady's other primary role was to be an inspiration. The knight fought battles, composed poetry, and performed noble deeds for her, to win her favor, or simply to express his devotion. She was the sun around which his universe revolved, but only as a passive celestial body, not as an active participant in his struggles or triumphs. Agency was often limited to granting or withholding a small favor, a glance, a token gestures that served primarily to propel the knight's narrative forward. She was a means to his spiritual or chivalric end, a symbol rather than a fully realized individual with her own agenda. Imagine Lady Philippa, who might have possessed a keen mind for strategy or a talent for governance. Yet the courtly poems would likely focus on her swan-like neck or angelic voice, and her capacity to inspire her suitor to valor, rather than her administrative acumen or her political astuteness. This constant framing of women as either desirable bodies or abstract inspirations denied them the full spectrum of their humanity. It erased their individual personalities, their practical contributions, and their subjective experiences, packaging them instead into convenient archetypes that served the male narrative. The very nature of courtly love, by focusing on the external and the inspirational, subtly but consistently dehumanized women, making them props in a grand male romance rather than fully autonomous beings. Number 10, it ignored the practical realities of marriage. In 1268, marriage was not primarily a romantic endeavor. It was a strategic alliance, an economic contract, and a means of securing lineage, power, and property. For noble women, marriages were typically arranged by their families, often from a very young age, to consolidate land, forge political alliances, or settle disputes. Personal affection, if it developed at all, was a bonus, not a prerequisite. Yet the courtly love ideal flourished in a context where married women were often the object of a knight's intense, often unconsummated, devotion, creating a stark and often painful contrast with the realities of their actual marital lives. Consider the daily life of a married noblewoman. She might be Lady Eleanor, married at 15 to Lord Bertrand, a man she barely knew and perhaps did not love. Her duties would be arduous and practical, managing the castle household, supervising dozens of servants, overseeing the production of food and goods, organizing feast days, and most importantly, bearing children, especially male heirs, to ensure the continuation of the family line. Her value to her husband and her family was inextricably linked to her ability to perform these duties and produce progeny. Her days were filled with the noise and demands of a busy medieval household, not with quiet contemplation of a distant lover. Into this practical, often unromantic, reality stepped the courtly lover. He would serenade her, write exquisite poems about her beauty and virtue, and perhaps secretly exchange glances or tokens. His love was portrayed as pure and spiritual, transcending the mundane realities of her marriage. But how did this love help Lady Eleanor when her child was sick, or when the granary was infested with rats, or when her husband was away fighting a war and the estate faced financial strain? Courtly Knight offered no assistance with these very real, pressing concerns. His love was a beautiful distraction, a fantasy, but one that offered no practical solutions to the often harsh realities of medieval marriage. Moreover, the emphasis on loving a married lady, often another man's wife, implicitly condoned a romantic ideal that directly conflicted with the societal and religious strictures surrounding marriage. While the love was often portrayed as chaste, the very notion of a powerful emotional attachment outside of marriage, even if spiritual, posed a significant threat to the sanctity and stability of the marital institution. Glorified an emotional infidelity that, while perhaps unconsummated physically, could still cause immense personal turmoil and societal disruption. Courtly love ideal, by hovering above the mundane and pragmatic, effectively ignored the profound complexities and challenges inherent in medieval marriage, offering a dreamy escape rather than a functional understanding of a woman's constrained marital reality. Number 11, it offered no protection against violence or abuse. The medieval world, even for those in the noble classes, could be a brutal and dangerous place. For women especially, the threat of violence, both from outside forces and within their own households, was a grim reality. Legal protections for women were scarce, and societal norms often allowed husbands considerable authority, sometimes bordering on control, over their wives. Courtly love ideal, while celebrating the lady's beauty and virtue, provided absolutely no mechanism for her protection against physical, emotional, or economic abuse, nor did it offer her any form of recourse in such situations. Imagine a noblewoman, Lady Isolde, the object of a knight's undying adoration in flowery verse. While he is pining for her from afar, Lady Isolde might be enduring a difficult marriage. Her husband, Lord Gareth, might be a harsh man, prone to fits of temper or even physically abusive. He might control her every movement, isolate her from her family, or make her life deeply miserable through cruelty or neglect. In such a scenario, what solace or solution did the courtly lover offer? His devotion was spiritual. His actions were directed towards performing heroic deeds or writing poems, not towards intervening in the domestic sphere. The chivalric code, which was often intertwined with courtly love, theoretically mandated the protection of women. However, this protection was usually extended to damsels in distress from external threats, dragons, bandits, or rival knights, not typically from the very men who were legally empowered to control them within their own homes. The knightly ideal of protecting a lady was about safeguarding her honor and her person in a public, often symbolic way, not about dismantling the patriarchal structures that allowed for internal domestic oppression. A knight would fight to defend a lady's castle, but rarely, if ever, would he challenge her husband's authority over her person. Furthermore, the very nature of courtly love, often being a secret and somewhat illicit devotion, meant that the knight was in no position to intervene directly in the lady's marital life. Such an intervention would not only be a breach of social etiquette, but could also be interpreted as a direct challenge to her husband's authority, leading to open conflict that would bring ruin upon the lady's reputation and potentially endanger her life. Courtly love narrative, by focusing on the romantic suffering and idealization, completely skirted the grim realities of domestic violence and the lack of a woman's legal avenues for protection. It offered a beautiful dream, but no practical shield against the very real dangers that many medieval women faced within the sanctity of their own homes. Number 12, it ignored the dangers of childbirth. In 1268, childbirth was an incredibly perilous event, the single greatest threat to a woman's life during her adult years. Maternal mortality rates were staggeringly high, with historians estimating that a significant percentage of women died either during childbirth or in the immediate aftermath due to infection, hemorrhage, or complications. This was not a rare occurrence, but a constant, looming shadow over every married woman's life, especially for noblewomen whose primary duty was to produce heirs. Yet the courtly love ideal, which exalted the lady's beauty and purity, remained almost entirely silent about this profound and terrifying reality. Imagine Lady Genevieve, the subject of a knight's fervent adoration. he composes verses about her radiant beauty and her celestial grace. Meanwhile, Lady Genevieve, having already survived several difficult pregnancies, faces another one. She knows that with each child she carries, she puts her life on the line. Pain, the fear of complications, the very real possibility of dying and leaving her children motherless. These were the profound anxieties that weighed heavily on medieval women. Courtly love narratives, however, did not acknowledge this fundamental aspect of a woman's existence. The lady was depicted as an ethereal being, a source of inspiration, but rarely as a biological entity prone to the very real and dangerous processes of human reproduction. The knight's love was spiritual, transcending the physical. There was no poetry about the agony of labor, the fear of infection, or the tragic loss of life during childbirth. Such earthly, messy, and perilous realities simply did not fit into the idealized, sanitized vision of courtly love. Moreover, the courtly love ideals focus on the lady as a beautiful, unblemished object meant that it ignored the physical toll that repeated pregnancies and childbirth took on a woman's body. The loss of youthful figure, the stretch marks, the general weakening of the body, these realities were in stark contrast to the eternal, unchanging beauty celebrated in the poems. By omitting any mention of childbirth and its inherent dangers, courtly love effectively sidelined one of the most significant, and often fatal, problems that women faced in the 13th century. It presented a romantic fantasy that completely detached the woman from her biological reality and the life-threatening duties that were central to her societal role. This silence was not just an omission, it was a profound erasure of a woman's most harrowing lived experience. Number 13, it exacerbated societal double standards for women. The courtly love ideal, while seemingly elevating the lady to a position of worship, inadvertently reinforced and even intensified the pre-existing double standards that governed the lives of men and women in 1268. Purity, chastity, and unwavering virtue were demanded of the lady, while the knight, the adoring suitor, was often permitted a far greater degree of moral flexibility, even within the confines of his pure devotion. Consider the expectations placed upon the courtly lady. She was to be a beacon of moral perfection, unblemished by worldly desires or physical indiscretion. Her very value in the eyes of her suitor and indeed of society was tied to her impeccable reputation and her perceived chastity, even if she was married. Any hint of impropriety, any perceived slip, could lead to severe social ruin for her, stripping her of honor, reputation, and potentially her social standing. Her worth was precarious, hanging by the thread of her perceived virtue. Now, juxtapose this with the male knight, the one doing the adoring. While he pledged pure devotion to his lady, the societal expectations for his own sexual conduct were far less stringent. A nobleman might have mistresses, engage in illicit affairs, or frequent brothels without suffering the same kind of irreparable social damage as a woman accused of similar transgressions. For him, a dalliance might be a youthful indiscretion or a sign of virility. For her, it was ruin. Courtly love narrative itself, by focusing on a married woman as the object of desire, created a delicate dance on the edge of impropriety, but the consequences of a misstep fell overwhelmingly on the woman. Furthermore, the knight's suffering in courtly love was often portrayed as ennobling, a spiritual journey through longing and denial. His unfulfilled desire, his torment, and his yearning were seen as proofs of his devotion and virtue. For the lady, however, a display of similar suffering or longing for an illicit attachment would be seen not as ennobling, but as a dangerous moral failing. She was expected to maintain a stoic, pure demeanor, even while inspiring such intense emotion in her suitor. The very act of being a lady in courtly love required an almost superhuman control over her own emotions and desires, far exceeding what was expected of her male counterpart. This inherent imbalance in expectations meant that courtly love, despite its lofty rhetoric, ultimately placed an even greater burden of moral responsibility on women, demanded an almost unattainable level of purity and emotional restraint from the lady, while the knight was allowed the romantic latitude of intense longing and self-improvement through suffering. It was a system that, beneath its shimmering surface, deeply embedded and exacerbated the societal double standards that disproportionately penalized women for any perceived moral transgression, real or imagined. Number 14, it elevated male suffering over female agency. At the very core of many courtly love narratives in 1268 lay a central theme, the profound, often exquisitely painful, suffering of the male lover. The knight would pine for his lady, endure the torments of unrequited love, perform heroic deeds to prove his worth, and experience a spiritual agony born of longing and denial. This suffering was not merely a side effect. It was often presented as the very crucible through which the knight achieved moral purity, self-improvement, and a heightened spiritual state. However, this intense focus on male suffering inherently relegated the woman's agency, her choices, and her own experiences to a secondary, often passive, role. Imagine the countless poems and songs describing the knight's sleepless nights, his tears, his desperate pleas for a mere glance or a kind word from his lady. His emotional landscape was meticulously detailed, his internal struggles laid bare for all to witness and admire. This narrative of his anguish was central to the romantic ideal. But what about the lady's inner world? Was she suffering too? Did she have her own desires, her own unfulfilled longings, or her own complex emotional reality beyond being the cause of his beautiful torment? Poems are largely silent on her active agency or her distinct emotional journey. The lady's role in this framework was to be the object of suffering, not typically a subject experiencing her own. She was the one who, by her very unattainability or her perceived distance, caused the knight's noble pain. Power lay in her capacity to inspire this suffering, and occasionally to alleviate it with a small favor. But her own desires, her own dreams, or her own independent actions were rarely explored. She was a catalyst for his story, not the protagonist of her own. If she did act, her actions were often framed as responses to his devotion, rather than expressions of her own independent will or desires. Furthermore, the very act of a woman exercising strong agency, making her own choices, pursuing her own ambitions, or expressing desires contrary to the knight's devotion, would often disrupt the delicate balance of the courtly love narrative. Agency might inadvertently lessen his suffering, thereby undermining the very source of his spiritual growth and heroic deeds. Thus, the ideal effectively contained and limited a woman's active role, requiring her to remain somewhat static and idealized so that the male protagonist's journey of suffering and self-discovery could unfold unimpeded. This meant that the grand, captivating stories of courtly love were overwhelmingly about what men felt and did, with women serving as beautiful, inspiring, but ultimately passive, accessories to their emotional and chivalric dramas. Number 15, it did not address the pressures of household management. In 1268, for a noblewoman, whether married or widowed, the management of a large castle or manor house was a monumental and deeply practical undertaking. Far from being a lady of leisure, she was, in essence, the chief operating officer of a complex medieval enterprise. Her responsibilities were vast and encompassed everything from the provisioning of food and drink for a large household, overseeing the production of textiles and clothing, managing servants, caring for children, to acting as a skilled herbalist and nurse when illness struck. These were critical, time-consuming, and often physically demanding duties that were vital to the survival and prosperity of the family. Yet the courtly love ideal, with its focus on poetic adoration and spiritual devotion, completely overlooked the immense pressures and practical challenges of a woman's daily household management. Imagine Lady Cecily, the inspiration for a troubadour's most celebrated song. While the poet is imagining her in a garden of eternal spring, Lady Cecily is wrestling with very earthly problems. Castle larder is running low on salted meat, the brewing of ale is behind schedule, a sudden illness is sweeping through the servant quarters, and she must dispense remedies and comfort. She is inspecting the weaving loom, ensuring sufficient wool is being processed, and overseeing the baking of bread for scores of people. Her mind is constantly occupied with logistics, inventory, and the well-being of everyone under her roof. These were not tasks that could be neglected for philosophical contemplation or romantic yearning. Courtly love narratives rarely depicted the lady engaged in such mundane, albeit crucial, activities. She was always portrayed in elegant repose, receiving her suitor's declarations, or perhaps engaged in gentle pursuits like embroidery or music. The very idea that she might be up to her elbows in supervising the slaughter of a pig for winter stores, or haggling over the price of grain with a tenant, simply did not fit the ethereal, idealized image of the courtly lady. The world of courtly love existed above these messy, unromantic, but absolutely essential daily realities. Moreover, the successful management of a medieval household required significant skill, organization, and a pragmatic mindset. It involved countless hours of planning, problem-solving, and direct supervision. The courtly ideal offered no recognition for these considerable talents and tireless efforts. It presented a vision of womanhood that was disconnected from the very real and demanding labor that defined the lives of most noblewomen. By romanticizing the lady's leisure and her role as a passive inspiration, courtly love inadvertently dismissed and devalued the immense practical contributions women made to the running of medieval society, failing to acknowledge the very real pressures and burdens that rested on their shoulders.